Greetings, good morning. It's Fred in Alaska. Happy holidays and all that blah blah bullshit. Um, let's see. What I wanted to share with you today. I've been meaning to put this video out a couple days now since like Christmas Eve, but Tahoe tried to kill me. Catastrophic caliper failure for the brakes, and anyway, got that fixed. Fun. What I want to share with you today comes from a couple trout fishermen, and these guys, man, they were out in the Tules for real. They were up at Burnt Cabin Creek, which is okay. The Nuyahcook River is fucking far from Dillingham. Okay, this is almost damn near double that, right? Insane. Great trout fishing, though. I mean, phenomenal for natural trout. Jesus, man. So these let's name them Stuart and Cliff. Okay, Stuart was the ringleader of the idea, and Stuart, originally from Idaho, lives down in Oregon. He had been coming to Alaska for many years, doing the fishing thing. Not his first time in the Bristol Bay area. He was down some of the places down by Naknek and the Kvichak and so on, up by Iliamna. And he just got the idea one day and just kind of was looking at the map and said, "There, I bet you there's good trout right there." Because And he's absolutely right. We get the largest salmon return in the world that go up the Nuyahcook River, the Wood River, the Snake River, and so on. Largest return in the world, undeniable. Millions upon millions of all five species, And so, up at where they were going is where the salmon go to spawn. They get back up into the flats and all the ponds back up in there, and that's where they spawn out. At least a large portion of them. And so, going on that knowledge, they went, late season to capitalize on the trout eating up the salmon eggs that kind of get away, and basically the nice and plump, good size, healthy fish. And so this was approximately 8 years ago. Stuart invites his buddy Cliff. His buddy Cliff still lived in Idaho, and basically was like, I'm all for it. Love to fly fish and all that. So they make their arrangements and whatnot, and they used a service out of Anchorage to fly them in. He reserved the cabin there, reserved it for 5 days, and they were gonna just get dropped in and do their thing, fish and have a great time. Well, they get there. It took a few extra days to get there, which only leaves them 3 days for their cabin reservation left. So he's doing his thing to change the itinerary for the cabin rental, and fortunately he was able to get it swapped to accommodate for the 2 weather days that they didn't account for, which it's Alaska. Weather rules all. I don't care what anyone says, unless you're going by road, and then even then you take your chances. But so they get there, and they were a little bummed out and tired from having that 2-day layover in Anchorage and waiting for a weather break. So they were like constantly on alert. They didn't want to go too far from the hotel and not be ready to take off from Lake Hood, and so they kind of wore themselves out a little bit in Anchorage, waiting to get out. Now Stuart said that one of his friends that lives in Anchorage loaned him a 12-gauge shotgun and plenty of bear ammo, buckshot, slugs, whatever, and also a 9mm pistol, just because they were going to be on a salmon river, in the fall. Bears are a serious issue. If you don't take it seriously, they write books about the shit. So if you're unaware, do some Google searches about bear attacks in Alaska and just heed the warning. So they get there, and Stuart said the first couple days they were just really groggy, trying to get moving, motivated. They were socked in, perfect fishing weather. They got their lines wet the first couple days, but only for about an hour or so, and trying to gain the energy. They were just both zapped. And so He said the night of that second day, it was going into dusk, and they were planning on going back out. And they get back down, and you got to understand the brush is a bitch. A lot of willows and alders and stuff just banking, right along the river bank. And there was one spot where it was shallower to where they could get across. And what I'll do is I'll show a map. And so they maneuver their way down, and there's a place where they got chest waders, so they cross there, and they're just going up around what is essentially it's not necessarily an island. It's where the river kind of branches and whatnot. There's just a split there right near the cabin. Heading west or whatever, it kind of splits, wraps around, and then continues on down. And Burke Creek is directly north of them. They were just got across this little shallower area, just above the knees, and they were going to wrap up and get on top of this. We'll call it an island for the sake of explanation. So they get up on there, and they can still see the cabin right over there, and they hear this shriek. The shriek was very loud, very powerful, and they couldn't tell where in the hell it came from because it sounded like it was all around them. So immediately they both look at each other. Cliff was like, fuck that. What is that? And Stuart was like, I don't know, but maybe we should just do this lower branch here and just fish that. And Cliff's like, no. Absolutely not. I'm going back inside. Well, I don't know what the hell that is. You need to come inside too. What is that? Well, Cliff had worked basically not a biologist, but helping in the field for a biology team years ago, and had time around bears, brown bears, grizzlies, black bears, and stuff. And so he wasn't a total novice when it came to natural sounds, and he deemed that not natural, which I totally understand. From what Stuart explained, that shriek was so ear-piercing and powerful, and he said it sounded like they were in an amphitheater because it was everywhere. They couldn't pinpoint a direction. And the amount of unease, he said immediately all the hair stood up on their arms and necks and stuff, and they just quietly maneuvered on back, followed their back trail, crossed back across, and went to the cabin. He said the rest of that night was fairly uneventful. They heard one more weird noise they couldn't quite make out because they were in the cabin and it was at a distance, and it sounded like it was coming from Burnt Cabin Creek. Again, he said it was just a loud noise. He couldn't tell if it was a roar, a moan, a scream, or whatever. It was just a loud enough noise that got their attention, and they couldn't quite make it out, because of distance. And so uneventful night. They got up the next morning in the wee hours, kind of rediscussed that weird, shriek sound. And they decided, okay, Cliff was like, well, give me one of the guns, And so Stuart said, here, take the shotgun. You like to take the lead anyway. You have the shotgun in case of bear. I'll carry the 9mm, and so they got their plan of action. They're going to continue and go and do what they were going to do the night before. Stuart said when they crossed the creek, the river basically, at its shallowest point there, he said when they got back up onto what we'll call the island, it's basically just where the river split around. But anyway, we'll just, for the sake of it, again, we'll call it the island. They get up on this island, and they're wrapping around going north up towards the Burnt Creek side, right? Fishing the whole time, caught a couple, not so, kind of lackluster, but fun nonetheless, And so Cliff got a little ahead of Stuart, and Stuart yells out, hey, don't get too far ahead of me. So Cliff stops, and Cliff was casting away, doing his thing, and as Stuart was catching up, basically casting as well, They could, I mean, the water is crystal clear. They could see down at the bottom, and they could see where the fish were, where the overhangs were, to where to cast and kind of let it drift by to, draw out the fish, the trout. And he said it was a perfect time of morning because it was just as the sun was about to come up, and you could see the sun hitting the tops of they're about 1,100 foot little, basically mounds, mountains, if you will, but I don't think they're tall enough for mountains, but these big hills, like buttes, and he said he was just sitting there, and he's like, where's the songbirds? It's in that moment, it dawned on him how freaking quiet it was, right? And so he starts kind of assessing the situation, looking around, checking his six and all that. He's like, there must be a bear around, so he gets Cliff's attention, gets closer to Cliff and says, hey, I think there's a bear around. I don't hear any song. With the sun coming up, there should be some songbirds or something, some kind of sound of wildlife. Cliff's sitting there listening. He's like, yeah, you're right. And so they take a moment. Cliff was changing out his gear anyway. As far as his lure, he was going to throw on a bloodworm, and because that's what Stuart had been having luck with, from what he was saying. And so as he's tying on this bloodworm, they're basically just a little below the mouth of Burnt Cabin Creek, right? I mean, they could see up it a little ways, but not very much from their vantage point, because they were just off, which would be to the west of it, right? The west of where the creek meets the Nushagak, which kind of goes up this long, kind of shallow valley, And so as they're at that point, they hear that shriek again, and it's coming from up Burnt Cabin Creek. And they both kind of sit there, and they're like, there's that noise again. What the hell is that? They had no clue. So they just kind of hunkered down where they were, listening and looking for movement. Stuart said that at one point Cliff stood up and was taking off his backpack, and he had his back towards the creek that Stuart was looking up, because where they were sitting at the edge, he kind of stood up and turned around to take the pack off, set it down, and turn around and lean back against it. But at that point where he was standing up, Stuart saw movement up the creek, and he said it looked like a big old black bear going out of the creek into the brush. And it was real fast. And so he got Cliff's attention and said, hey, a big black bear just, cut up into the brush over there. That must have been what was making that noise. Cliff was like, bears don't make those kind of noises, They can make some god-awful noises, but that's a shriek, like a woman, like, it made no sense. And so he said, hey, I know what I saw. And so Cliff was like, it was a black bear? And he goes, yeah, it was freaking huge. And so they have this little debate about how big black bears can get and so on, right? So now both their attention is up Burnt Cabin Creek. And as they're looking, they notice a dark form. And it was like they would see it right there, and then a moment later, it'd be a little closer and a little closer. But the form they were seeing was not bear-like. It was man-like, and with the way the sun was coming from the east, this thing was in the shade of this about 1,200 foot mound, mountain or whatever, just to their east. I mean, it was right there. So the way the sun direction was coming, this thing was in shadow. It was silhouetted in the alders and the willows. And he said this thing, it was like incrementally getting closer. Each, every couple moments it was a little bit closer. And they were like, that is not bear behavior, It was really weird. They felt like it was looking at him, dropping out of view, coming back into view, looking at him again, dropping out of view, predatory type things, So Stuart said that's when he got real uneasy, and Cliff was like, maybe we should, let's move down a little ways and see, give us room between us and whatever this. It's not a black bear. Give us room to react if it's something, with ill intent. they both agreed, and they moved a little further to the west on that upper channel where Burnt Creek comes into it. Stewart said they got about another maybe 150 feet ish, because they were moving slow and quiet and keeping an eye, right? So as they do that, he said they got about 150 feet before this thing came out almost at the mouth of the creek. He said it couldn't have been more than maybe 50, 60 feet back from the mouth of the creek where it meets the Nushagak. Comes out and it's standing, and it's still in the shadow of that butte, that mountain. And he said it stood there, and he said it was the darkest thing he had ever seen. It was darker than pitch black, you know, and I could relate. I've seen similar. But he said the thing of it was, it came out and was standing in the creek and was looking right in their direction and started swaying back and forth, faster and faster, right? And it was all happening real quick. And so Cliff was like, hey, that dude needs to calm down. And again, Bigfoot, hairy man, none of that was popping in their head at the moment, right? Because from their vantage point, the way things were, they weren't able to grasp exactly how big this thing was just yet. And so they're seeing it, and when it came into the creek, he wasn't sure exactly how deep the creek was there where it came out into, but they were seeing basically from just above the knees out of the water and up. So to them it was a large dude, but it wasn't registering exactly the overall size of this thing. And as they were kind of staring, and Cliff kind of had the shotgun and was like, well, let's get that guy's attention, you know. So they start hollering, hey, we're over here. And this thing never stopped looking at him, was swaying back and forth faster and faster. And then it drops down, which when it dropped down into basically all fours, it was just head and shoulders they could see above the water, and it kind of leapt back out in the direction it came out from, which really was, he said it was so bizarre how it just dropped down and then jumped out. It was just such a weird, and, you know, I asked him, you know, do you know how deep it is there? And he wasn't aware, you know, they didn't go and measure or nothing. But this thing leapt out back into the brush, and then they saw brush moving and noises and weird growls and sounds being made as this thing kind of moved away back up Burnt Cabin Creek. So they were like, okay, now is the time. Let's, because that's obviously not a dude, you know, a sane man doesn't act that way, you know. And so basically they had to backtrack the way they came. Because again, they were breaking trail outside of some small game trails, you know, which is not easy to do. Breaking trail can be some serious pain in the ass. So they start backtracking, and once they're straight on again with Burnt Cabin Creek, this thing pops out again, splash. And at that point, they both stop and they're watching, because all of a sudden they hear this splash, 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 splash. It's coming down the creek towards them, right? Like right at them. And Cliff freaks out, stands up, because initially when they heard the splash, they kind of both hunkered down a little bit, got a little lower. And Cliff stands up with the shotgun and aims it that direction. And this thing didn't give a flying rat's ass. Kept coming at them. But again, it's at a distance. It's not like it's right on them or anything, but Cliff took that as enough to pop a round off, right? As soon as he lets the shot go, it startled the hell out of Stewart, because he wasn't expecting it, because he was so transfixed on this thing coming down the creek. Fire, you know, the gunshot goes off, and all of a sudden this thing veers off into the brush again, like it had, you know, where it came from originally. Stewart's like, what the hell? What, did you shoot it? And he goes, you know, Cliff was like, no, it was a warning shot. And so again, this thing is in the brush making noise. They can see the brush moving. They can hear these weird noises, growls, whoops, some clicking and popping, and some other stuff. And they were like, what the hell? So they continued on retreating. You know, while this thing wasn't actively watching them, they kind of scooted around. They made it back to the cabin. which in the big scheme of things is just right over there. Yeah, I mean, it's not that far, not far enough for my liking, you know. So they get back to the cabin, and you know, this is just after sunup, you know, on day 3, and they're kind of assessing what the hell, what do we do with that, you know. And so again, you know, they weren't registering hairy man whatever, but there was talk of a feral human, right? Is that, you know, some hunter that got lost and now he's a maniac or something, you know? Maybe he killed black bear and has a black bear, you know, outfit on or whatever, and so they're discussing all these things because it had to have been large the way it was moving in the creek, the way it leapt out of the creek. All these movements weren't like someone in a suit or a fur, you know, garment get up, you know. And so eventually the conversation makes it around to Bigfoot, and they're both kind of like, really, a Sasquatch, like, really, you know, because again, it wasn't really in their wheelhouse. So they start discussing, all, well, you know, there's stupid TV shows about it and this and that. Maybe there's some truth to some of it, you know. They couldn't discount it now after what they just seen, right? And so they're debating whether or not feral human, Sasquatch, whatever. And as they're having this discussion, they had the door open on the cabin, and every once in a while, Cliff would go over to the door and look out it, and he had it open to hear. And so, you know, they got the sounds of the river, which wasn't overly loud or anything, and the wind blowing every once in a while, rustling of the, you know, leaves and everything like that. And as he's making his way back up to the door for like the 3rd or 4th time during this whole conversation period, as you know, it's going on into, you know, just before noon, they hear that shriek again. But this time, as Cliff gets to the door to look out it, the shriek is somewhere right around them, right? I mean, it is loud. Stewart said it was so loud it startled him out of where he was sitting at this little bench seat thing, and he jumped up, grabbed the shotgun because it was sitting right next to him, grabbed the shotgun and comes over by the door. Cliff is looking around. I found it comical that Stewart grabs the shotgun, is going to the door. Cliff turns, goes right past him looking for the same shotgun, right? So anyway, Stewart's at the door and he's kind of looking around, and he was like, did you hear where that came from? And Cliff said, straight out, you know, straight outside the door. Well, the way this little trail is down to the river, there was nothing there to see, right? And so they didn't know where it was coming from. And then they heard it again, and then it was obvious it was somewhere behind the cabin, and they were hearing the echo as it hit that little, you know, the little river and brush area. And so they were like, oh shit. So Stewart kind of goes out the door, goes around to the side, and is looking back towards behind the cabin, and sure enough, about 70 feet or so off the back of this cabin through the brush, he sees this dark movement. And it's going back and forth, but as it's going back and forth, it's getting closer. So he retreats inside and tells Cliff, hey, it's coming this way. So inside the little cabin door, off to the right-hand side as you step in, is these little seats, little window. And then you got the wood stove over here on the left-hand side, and then a small little countertop area and a loft up top. Small window in the loft, small window behind the sink, and just the one window off to the right, and then the wood stove or whatever. He said he comes inside, Cliff is right there, they shut the door, and they both look out that window on the right hand side. I guess, if you're looking at the cabin from the front, it would be to the right. If you're in it, it's to the left facing the door, whatever. So they start looking out that, and as they're standing there, Stewart's holding the shotgun, and they're looking, and they could see this darkness coming closer and closer out of the brush, and it pops up, it stands up almost like dead even with that window, because as it was moving closer, they said that it looked like it would peak up and drop back down, kind of like it was doing before up on Burnt Cabin Creek. Said as soon as it got parallel with the cabin at the window, it stood up, and when he said that's when they understood its overall size. He said this thing was at least 11 foot tall, 4.5 foot wide at the shoulders. Not bodybuilder kind of build, but real close to it. Very muscular, very powerful looking, and it was pitch black. He couldn't, I was, asking about features or anything, and he said it was pitch black. And with the way the sun was rising from the east, they could not, it was still in the shadow of the cabin, right? So they couldn't make out anything other than the slightest glint of light in the black eyes. That's all they could make out. It wasn't like eye shine or nothing, but just, the life in the eyes, so to speak. And it stood there and started swaying again, faster and faster and faster and faster. And they're just in shock watching this. All of a sudden it drops down and tears off the direction of Burnt Cabin Creek. And he said when it took off fast. I mean, just, it was working itself up, back and forth faster and faster, and then bam, it was gone. Startled them, how quickly it took off. Stuart said they looked at each other like, what the hell? Cliff was like, holy shit, runs over to the door and opens it. And then when they open it and look, some of their view was obscured by the brush, but they seen the brush and this, periodically this dark mass as it tore across the river, back up onto that island thing, and just gone in the direction of Burnt Cabin Creek. They were like, holy shit, what the hell do we do with that? And so, now granted, you got to understand, this is halfway through day 3 of a 5-day. Not counting God forbid, weather comes in and messes everything up. So they spend the rest of that day very, very close to the cabin. Obviously, they didn't want to go out. I totally understand. They were having discussions about Bigfoot. Do they remember hearing anything on how to deal with them, what to do? They can't. Where are they going to go? They got flown in. It's, where are they going to go? So they play it safe. Morning, day 4. They wake up and they hear this hellacious scream coming way up Burnt Cabin Creek. That he said it had to have been miles away. It was but it was still loud, but you could tell it was at a good distance. So they heard that first thing at sunrise because they'd been wanting to fish, but they were too scared to leave the cabin. They didn't know what the hell this thing was going to do or whatever because of how it was acting. And so they decide, well, let's just go right down here, right in front of the cabin, do some fishing. We'll keep an eye out. We'll have, enough view to, if we have to retreat, we could shoot. We can get back to the cabin. And so they both agreed. Now, Cliff had been trying to he had one of these, original version digital cameras. It was like 4 megapixel or something. He was trying to get that into operation, but all the batteries he brought, up until that morning of day 2 or whatever it was, when our morning of day 3 or somewhere before the original shriek, it was able to take pictures just fine, and the batteries were all functional. They were all brand new. And he kept trying to get this camera to turn on. It wouldn't turn on. The batteries seemed to be dead. All this stuff. So he's like, well, crap. Couldn't even take pictures of the fish they catch. So they, without that not working, he was a little frustrated, but they make it down to the river and they do some fishing. And as they're fishing, it was, they were not enjoying themselves. They were constantly looking around, any kind of noise in the brush, any wind breeze, that blew leaves and rustled. Immediately they were overwhelmed by it. Stuart said he maybe cast about 4 separate times. He had gotten a couple nibbles, which normally would totally psych him out, and he'd be fishing on until he caught one. He'd do it for hours. Well, as they were sitting there, they heard that shriek again, and it sounded like it was way up, Burnt Cabin Creek. He said when they heard that, Cliff just immediately looked at him, shook his head, and pointed let's go back to the cabin, so they did. Now this is day 4. This is in the morning. Stuart and Cliff were sitting there debating, well, shit, this is a bust. We can't even enjoy our fishing. What the hell is this thing? And their debate goes back again to, have you heard anything? Whatever. You see how fast it moved, going over all these things, different behaviors of bobbing up and going down, getting closer, all of it, right? Running down the creek, splashing down on all fours, leaping out, all of it. They just kept going, which I could totally understand. And unfortunately for them, they're stuck where they're at. The plane's supposed to be coming the next day. So they spend that night just mellow inside, opening the door every once in a while. Cliff was a smoker, so he would step outside. He would smoke a cigarette, kind of look around, jokingly say, hopefully it's not behind us, something like that. Just trying to break the nervous tension. So the evening of day 4, they just got done eating. They had a bucket of water, soapy water, that they would put the dishes into immediately rinse it off and get the smell off it because of bears and whatnot, right? And so they scrubbed off the dishes. They dipped it into some hot water. Now this is just river water, so they had limited supplies that they flew in with, but it was their dishes, so hey, whatever, so they got done doing dishes basically, right? And their frying pan, they had some fried potatoes and some bacon or something, and so that was soaking a little longer in that soap bucket, and they set it outside. And this is still about an hour before dusk. And so they got a soapy bucket with the frying pan still in it. The other bucket that had the hot water, they had dumped out, and it was turned upside down just to sit while the other one, because they were going to reheat some water to rinse off the skillet, which soapy skillet, teaches them. So anyway, they had that out there. Cliff was smoking a cigarette sitting on one of the 3 steps. And as he was doing so, the buckets were immediately off to his right-hand side, just down at the bottom of the steps, off about maybe less than 10 feet, And as he's sitting there smoking a cigarette, this thing walks from just out of nowhere, just walks right out, just right past, knocks over the bucket, looks down at it, looks back at Cliff. Cliff said the face was very, very dark. It looked very greasy, a lot of wrinkles, looked like a caveman, nothing like an ape, big, broad, fat, bulbous kind of nose, eyes deep and sunk in, very heavy brow ridge, and the eyes just appeared to be black, and he just sitting there. This thing is like not even 10 feet away from him, and just walks on down the trail. Just looks back at him like, he said he was freaking out, but he didn't sense any outward aggression. Knocking over the bucket and looking down at it was more of like, what is this? Kind of a curiosity, kind of, nothing for me. And just looked back at him and then just walked on down the trail. And at that point, he's in shock, like, what the hell am I seeing? And all of a sudden, Stuart is behind him. Stuart said when he was sitting there, the door was open, and he had his back against the wall on the little small bench with the table and the window, and the wood stove is right in front of him, and he's looking out periodically because he was about to complain to Cliff to shut the door because his cigarette smoke was coming back in the door, right? And he said he was just standing up to go and complain and give Cliff a hard time when he saw this thing come into view walking down the trail. And Cliff was just kind of like, pushing back against the steps or whatever. Stuart said he immediately grabbed that 9mm handgun and got behind Cliff at the door and fired shots into the air, which scared the shit out of Cliff at the same time, because he was in shock of what was just happening. All of a sudden, bam, 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 bam. So it's chaotic a minute. The thing takes off, just boom, gone, just like it had done the day before or whatever. And brush, after it swayed, it was gone. It was moving so fast. So they're freaked out. They retreat back inside. Cliff is like, what the hell are you doing? You scared the shit out of me, And so they're going back and forth. And I'm not trying to laugh at that's real freaky shit. Just the scene I see in my mind is just like, holy shit. I could imagine it was not fun. And so they're inside, they're arguing back and forth. What the hell, I didn't even hear it. It was just there, The Stewart's like, calm down. What happened? He goes, fuck, I'm sitting there smoking a cigarette. Buckets are right there. All of a sudden this thing walks out, kicks the one bucket over, looks down at it, turns, looks at me, and you came out within a split second later firing the damn gun. And between the two of them, they were guessing, it was at least 12 foot tall, about the same 4.5 foot wide, because they obviously had different perspective of it at that point. Said after it ran off and they were inside, it got dead quiet going into dusk, right? And so at dusk, Cliff wanted to have one more cigarette before it got dark, because he wasn't going to go outside and he wasn't going to smoke inside because Stewart didn't. So he's standing there at the door, kind of half out it, half in it, holding on to the doorknob, smoking a cigarette real fast. I could understand 100%. They got in their lantern, fired up, and it was on the little, I guess you'd call it a kitchen counter area, real small counter. And it was just sitting there. And so Cliff was like, yeah, I'm not seeing any movement. Had the 9mm in his pocket, and basically smoked a cigarette as fast as he could. And he leaned down, put it out on the steps. And it had been drizzling a little bit as it was going on into the evening. And what they were worried about is with this drizzling being socked in and the plane not making it the next day. So they were kind of anxious about that. They sit down after Cliff has his cigarette and they're discussing what the hell, and should we put something in front of the door? Excuse me, all that kind of stuff. Well, there was the most there was the deadbolt thing or whatever, but the thing of it is a lot of these cabins are left unlocked. They're not like locked up. They're survival cabins, so you can reserve them, but you can also make use of them in a survival situation. No harm, no foul, shit. Well, what he ended up doing is there was a piece of, someone had put up some trim on half of this door on the inside, right, and the door opened pulling in. And so what he did was they had about 4 or 5 different types of knives, and what he did was he stuck the knives in between the trim and the door to kind of make another type of a lock, and he did it, spaced them out. He had like 4 or 5 of them, and he went, top to bottom, evenly spaced. And so that was their barricade. Which, hey, I mean, do what you got to do. My cousin was wanting to use a single 16-penny nail. So anyway, so it was quiet, nothing going on, and they get ready to crash out. Cliff didn't want to be stuck up in the loft. He wanted to be able to maneuver, which I would rather be in the loft and have the high ground. But anyway, so Stuart was like, I'll crash up there or whatever. Cliff was down with the 12 gauge down on the lower portion, and Stuart, went up to the end of the loft. Stuart said that just as they were falling asleep, there was a bam, bam, something banged, shook the whole cabin. Immediately, Cliff was like screaming. Nothing, didn't hear anything else. It got quiet again, and neither one of them slept the rest of the night. However, come sunrise, it was a little foggy and they were worried, but the sunlight, then the fog dissipated rather quickly to a beautiful morning. Songbirds, everything was as it should have been the whole time. And so they're both out looking around. They're tending to the skillet stuff that was still needed to be finished up. And as they're discussing, they both walked together down to the river. They're songbirds and stuff, so the energy was totally different, right? They didn't feel as nervous. They get down there, they get things washed up, because Stuart was covering Cliff with the shotgun, for obvious reasons. And so as they're getting back up to the cabin, they hear their plane. off in the distance. They're like, oh shit, there must be a system moving and he's coming a little early. So they gather up all their stuff, and they had to walk down a little ways to where the plane had to land or whatever because of wind direction and all that. So they get it all figured out, and Cliff is holding one of the ropes from the strut on one of the wings of the plane. They didn't want to divulge which service they used out of Anchorage, which is, I mean, there's only so many. But anyway, the person that was there to pick them up was like, yeah, there's some severe storms moving in, and we were supposed to come, later on this afternoon, but I wanted to take the window so we didn't miss a window and you guys be stuck here a week. They were thankful. So as they're getting everything loaded up, the energy changed again, right? And as the guy, the pilot was kind of in the back of the plane adjusting for weight and everything, their gear, he comes out, and Stuart was attempting to hand him some of the fly fishing poles, right? Because they each had a few of them, different lengths and whatever, weights or whatever. And he was handing it to him, and they heard the shriek coming from across the river. Now, they're just west of that island, right, where Burnt Creek is north of. And they were just west of that, and they heard it coming from that direction, and the pilot was like, what the hell was that? And they both were like, we don't know. And then Cliff chimes in, well, we know, but we don't know. It looked like a huge caveman. It was massive. And the guy kind of chuckled. He goes, really? And he was like, you mean like Bigfoot? And they both kind of looked at him and was like, yeah, exactly like that. And so the pilot was kind of taken aback and was like, yeah, I've seen some pretty strange stuff flying around. Kind of shared a little bit of, seeing something running across a meadow or this and that. But, because of the height difference being up in the plane and the perspective, he just chalked it up as, maybe a moose or something that he's just getting a weird look at. And so they're having this brief discussion, and they hear the shriek again. This time it is a lot closer, and it sounded like it was coming from that island, right? And so the pilot was like, is this everything here? And he was like, Cliff and Stuart were like, yeah. He goes, well, let's get moving here. They get it finished up, they get loaded up, and they had to taxi down, turn around, and take off, right? And they're taking off, going towards that island. And as they gotten into the air, and they were only a few hundred feet, and gaining altitude as they're climbing out. And as they started to bank and turn towards I guess it would be southeast, just gaining altitude and climbing into the wind, the pilot noticed this thing down on that island, right? And so as he's climbing, he decides he levels off at about 500 feet and circles back and comes back and comes at a little lower altitude, a couple hundred feet off the ground, but kind of buzzing that island, and he was kind of turning to the left a little bit. Stuart said as they were going with the ear things on, he was saying, yeah, down, is kind of pointing out some of the events. And the pilot goes, there it is. And they see it in the water right near where they had just been banked at the river loading up. Stuart said from the vantage point of being in the air, they could see this thing. It was still massive, but at a couple hundred feet up in the air, the perspective looking down, it was, they couldn't tell its overall height, basically. So Stuart was explaining that thing is actually really massive. And the pilot goes, yeah, I could tell. But it is literally in the water at the riverbank where they just were, where they had just, taken off from, And they couldn't tell what it was doing, but it was there, almost like inspecting, And so the pilot checks himself, catches the air, the wind or whatever, gains some more altitude, comes back and flies back by at a much higher altitude, and it was no longer there. When they get back to Anchorage, the service hub is right there at Lake Hood, right? And so they get over there, they're getting unloaded. They have a little little van, you know, a courtesy van to get them to their hotel or airport or whatever. They had a night in Anchorage, and so they were telling the driver, yeah, we're going over here. And the pilot's talking to their shuttle driver and saying, yeah, you know, there's damn Bigfoot out there. And they all just kind of nervously chuckle. But it wasn't expanded upon. He just said, we saw a Bigfoot. The shuttle driver's like, oh, okay. You know, like, whatever, you know. And, you know, I asked her, did it seem like it was a common thing? And he goes, well, not really. It just, the way the pilot acknowledged it, hey, we saw a Bigfoot. We didn't really say much. We just kind of nervously chuckled, like, yeah, we did. And the shuttle driver was like, okay. Like, almost like it wasn't given the level of importance or like it deserved or whatever. But I mean, hey, what do you do? You know, I want to thank Stuart and Cliff for reaching out. He had been pondering reaching out for the last couple of years and just kind of hesitated, and finally, you know, he did. I want to thank them both. And also, there's other encounters. I've been trying to get a hold of some people because of the process I do. I talk to people several times, and just to make sure I have all the finer details down. But one of them says they're willing to be recorded, which is great. Hey, I give each and every person the opportunity to be recorded, and a lot of times when push comes to shove, they're like, well, I'll let you do it. You do a good job. But anyway, we'll see. Thank you to Cliff and Stuart. Again, happy holidays, you know, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.